Hi there. In the last video, I showed you a little demo about how we can incorporate Navigation Experimental into our application. And we upgraded React Native to the latest version. We added an additional reducer or two reducers to our application, and then a few different actions. So now that we've put some of that boilerplate in, or some of that infrastructure, I should say, we can start to refactor our application with some of the additional components that we're going to need to make this thing dance. Let's get started with the detail. So I mentioned in the last video that we are going to have a new kind of component or a new container in our application, and it was going to be this kind of detail view. And so for the detail view, I'll start off by just looking at the about. It's a very simple component, just basically renders about on the screen, and we can already see that in action over here. So I'll just grab that as a starting point, and under containers, I'm going to create a new container called detail.js. Paste that in for now. And we'll say that this is detail. Just rename this to detail. And I'm also going to need some additional functionality from Redux to make this thing work properly. I'm just going to yank in the connect, bind action creators, and action creators because I'm going to be working with some of those things down the line. And in terms of components that I'm going to work with, I know that I'm going to need the image and the touchable highlight, which will enable me to go forwards and backwards. And that should be it for now. So we'll just keep this nice and light and simple for now, and then we can come back to the detail component after we've refactored the app container. So in the last video, I talked a little bit about how the app container was going to be refactored, and we were going to create this new component called the scene container. And the scene container was going to handle the animation between different components and that transition that is so necessary for making a native experience work. So let's go to the app container. Now we're going to need to change a few things here. Number one, we have our home component, which is great. We have the application tabs. Actually, we don't need the home component because that's now inside the application tabs. And we're going to be importing a lot of things from React Native now. So number one, let me just type this out. So we have import, and we're going to import from React Native. What are the things we need? We need animated, because we're going to be doing some animation. We're going to need style sheet, potentially. View, of course, navigation experimental. And I think that'll be it for now. And then for navigation experimental, we're going to pull out some of the functionality that comes with it. Namely, we're going to need well, actually for now, I know we're going to need the transitioner, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So let's just start with that. So we are plucking this out of Navigation Experimental, and we're just giving it a name that we can then call directly. Okay. So the other thing that we're going to need is we're going to need the navigation card. So again, there are some components that come with Navigation Experimental for modals, etc. One of them is this kind of card function. And in there is an interpolator. The interpolator handles all of the style transformations to go from one page to the next. So that's called the pager style interpolator. Now, the reason that I have any idea about how these things work is that I've been looking at a lot of the example code in the UI Explorer. So if you have a chance, I definitely recommend taking a look at that because it's changing constantly, but it shows you sort of the best practices in terms of working with React Native. So definitely worth taking a peek. So we have the interpolator, and we have the transitioner, and we have the navigation card, so everything seems to be okay over there. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite this render method. And instead of returning the application tabs, which is what we were doing before, we're going to actually return a navigation transitioner, which is going to take a prop of navigation state, which, if you remember in the last video, we actually defined. This is the reducer that we just created, the navigation state reducer. And then we're also going to specify a special render method that the transitioner will take ownership of. Okay. So in order for the navigation state to function, of course, we need to pass that in as a prop. And right now, we are not passing any props from the reducer into the app container. In fact, our connect method just returns an empty JSON struct. So we want to change that, of course. So let's take a look at the home component where we're doing something similar. We have a map state to props function. So I can just take that. Except I'm not really interested in searched recipes in this case. In this case, I'm interested in the navigation state. Pass that in, and then get rid of this function, and we're going to use map state to props instead. Oops. Okay, so we have the navigation state, and we have this render method. For now, the render method, let's just keep it really, really simple. I'm just going to return application tabs, which is what was there before. And let's try refreshing this. Okay. Not happy with me. Line 22. Oh, I think I forgot to do something here, which is that the pager style interpolator has to be plucked out of navigation card. Okay, so far so good. We can see that the app is still running and the transitioner isn't doing any transitioning, but at least it's getting this props navigation state. And if I just check that by doing a console.log on this.props, and we go back here, refresh the simulator, and there we go. I can see that the navigation state is coming through. And if I take a look at it, my index is presently 0, and the 2 routes that I've defined are coming through as potential routes in the application. So the next step is taking a little bit more care in our render method. Now, the render method is going to render essentially all the scenes that are available to our application. So rather than just passing in no arguments, the transitioner will actually pass in those scenes. That's part of its job, is to tell the render method that we provide the current transition state of that scene. And so this is very similar to what you can find in the UI Explorer. And I personally would expect this to change a little bit, but right now it's working pretty nicely. And in fact, as a pattern for doing animated code, it makes total sense. And it's fairly straightforward. So if it has to change, it's probably not going to be a big deal. So we are going to take transition props dot scenes, and then we're going to map them. So we get a collection of scenes. And then for each scene in our map, we get a constant called scene props, which is going to be an explosion of the transition props, or destruction, depending on your terminology. So any of the props that are available at that state of the transition, and then the scene itself. And then in our map, we will simply return this dot render scene with these new scene props. And so it's going to be in this render scene method where we get the scene props that we're going to render our scene container. But for now, just like we did before, let's just pass down the application tabs. And instead, we'll just return the application tabs for now. Refresh this again. Render scene, render scene. Right. So the reason this is not coming through is that the actual this context is not bound properly. And this happens when you're dealing with ES6 classes rather than dealing with React.createElement. And so let's just fix that by specifying a constructor, which will take in props, super props. This will pass it down to the component. And then we'll do this dot underscore render equals this dot underscore render dot bind this. So it will bind the context of the class down to the render scene prototype function and then also the render prototype function. Now we refresh again. And it looks like we're okay. Now we're not seeing too much. It's not very exciting yet. And that has probably more to do with the formatting of the page than anything else. So here I've got my render scene method. I've got the scenes. Let's take a look at this a little more closely. The scene props, render scene, right. So I'm rendering the scene and I'm passing it down. And then ultimately in my render method, I need to return something. I can't just return nothing. So here I'm just going to return actually a view. And this is probably why we're not seeing anything. I have to take up the entire space of the view. And drop the scenes in there. Refresh this again. And there we go. So now we're getting an interesting behavior, which is that we've got fetch recipes and we're getting this key error. And the reason we're getting this scene twice is because in any case, no matter what happens, I'm always passing in the application tabs. So in the first video, I was talking about how we need a scene container, and it's the scene container that handles the animations. And this is in fact where the scene container is going to get rendered so that we don't end up with this kind of silliness. So instead of just returning an application tabs here, I'm just going to return a scene container, which will take in the scene props that have been destructed. And the key for that will be sceneprops.scene.key. And this is the key that we defined in the reducer right here. So it's either going to be application tabs or detail. And this way it will be unique. So the scene container is going to be the one that's going to do the rendering, and it's also going to be the one that's going to do the animation. Now the scene container is a very simple component, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to just load it and define it all in this one file. So I'm just going to create a class called scene container, which will extend component. And it will have a render method. And the render method will return, and this is where we're going to use the animated functionality. It will return an animated view, which is like a view, but it allows interpolation, and we'll define the style, and the style is where the interpolation will come in. And we'll just close out the animated.view. And then I'm going to create a variable here, which is going to be called scene. And then for now, I'm just going to check if this .props.scene.root.key is equal to application tabs. Then scene is going to equal application tabs. And if the key is detail, then the scene is going to be detail. Of course, you could also do this with a switch statement. But now that I've defined a variable called scene here, I can then use it as a component in my JSX code. And then I'm just going to pass down the props. And then I'm going to say that the style is the style. So the last thing that we need is a definition of what the style is. And this is, once again, where React Native's Navigation Experimental is going to come in. So we're going to say that there's a const of type style, and it's going to be actually an array of styles. And one of them is going to be that interpolator that we talked about a few moments ago. So we have the navigation pager style interpolator. And because we're going forwards and backwards, we're going to say it's for horizontal this dot props. Now, this looks okay. We have application tabs, we have detail. I'm importing application tabs, but I'm not importing details, so we have to bring that in. And the last step in this whole process is to define my style sheet. This is typically the best practice, which is that you want to define your style sheet for any components at the bottom. And you want to do it using stylesheet.create. So here we'll say scene. We're going to use this in just a moment. Flex is 1. And this is very important. The position is actually going to be absolute. And the reason we're using absolute positioning within a Flexbox grid or a Flexbox design is because that way React Native can move things left and right and the behavior is going to be correct. So bottom's going to be 0, top's going to be 0, left is going to be 0, and right is going to be 0. And then here our style is going to be styles.scene with a comma. Now, refresh this again, and I get an error on line 75, which is that I'm missing a parenthesis. It'd be helpful if I was more consistent. And if I fetch recipes, the API still functions. So far, so good. So everything seems to be working okay. Now, of course, there's no way to actually get to this other detail view. So now we have to do a little more work to make sure that when I tap something, I'm actually going to go to the detail of that page. So let's do that next. So we've implemented the app container refactor. Now let's take a look at the home component and see how we can use this new functionality that we've implemented to jump from one page to another. So over here, I have a touchable highlight already imported. And I'm just going to wrap my image in a touchable highlight component. The key is going to still be recipe.id, which means that we can remove that from the view component. In a previous video, we actually defined this code, so I'm sort of jumping over it quickly so we can stay on topic here. And then when I tap this thing, I'm going to say onPress, and I want to do this .props.navigate, and then the key is going to be detail, and I'm going to say the ID is going to be the recipe ID. So here we're using the action that we defined in the actions navigate. We have our onPress behavior, so that when I tap on this, it should take me to the detail view, and the navigation params reducer is going to look for anything in the action, and it's going to store that in its reducer. So if we refresh this again, and I close my touchable highlight, fetch recipes, and when I tap on this, it takes me to the detail view. Now, if we take a look at the debugger, we can see that we have the navigation params with the ID, which is great, and we have the navigation state, and our index has changed from 0 to 1, and 1 corresponds to the detail route. So you can do all sorts of things to extend Navigation Experimental with other keys, but given that this is a relatively simple example, and I already have some kind of reducer that has the state of the application, I can just query the searched recipes by ID to get the recipe information that I need to finish this example. So let's take a look at the detail view for a second. Right now, our detail component is very, very simple. It's not doing very much at all. However, with a bit of code, we can do something a little more interesting, and we can implement the back button and maybe provide a little more information than just the word detail. So the first thing I want to do is create a method called recipe. And I'm going to grab something from the state. And in order to grab something from the state, I'm going to need to turn this into a smart component, which means instead of exporting default class detail, I'm going to do something similar to what I have with home, where I map the state to props. And so instead of exporting home here, I'm going to export detail. I'm going to take the searched recipes, and I'm also going to take the navigation params. So with these two keys, I should be able to return a recipe. And so because these things are being mapped to the props of the detail component, I can then return this.props.searched recipes, this.props.navigationparams.id, or just return null. And then here, if this.recipe, actually, let's just pull that out. So I'll say that there's a constant here, recipe. I can say if there's no recipe, just return null. All right. Now let's just finish off the example. We have a view here, which looks lovely. And we want to have a touchable highlight. I'm just going to sort of freestyle this. Give it 20 pixels of padding, background color of dark gray, and then on press, what do I do on press? I do this.props.navigate back. Which comes from, really it comes from React Native Navigation Experimental again. And then I'm just going to have a text component inside saying go back. Close that out. Refresh this again. And what am I missing here? Padding vertical up. Okay. Fetch the recipes. Background color supplied to, oh, typo. Refresh that again. This.props.navigate back. Right, so I mapped the states, but I did not map the actions. And so I need access to the actions as well. In this case, we can look at application tabs as an example of that, where we grab the bind action creators. So we have action creators and bind action creators. We just have to connect those as well. Refresh that again. Fetch the recipes, and now we can go back and forward. Very good. So the last step of this is to just render the recipe. Fortunately, we already have code that does this, and we can definitely refactor this. But for now, I'm just going to yank this out because it's getting a little long in the tooth. And then I'm also going to increase the font size here, and then show some additional information about the ingredients. Now, there are some additional styles that have been defined here that come from the home page. So let me just grab those. Now, ideally, we would refactor these into a generic style class. Just going to import style sheet. And the example that I'm going to post online will be a little bit cleaner in that respect. So now when I click on this, I get the ingredients, I get a detail view, and I can go backwards and I can go forwards. And then I've got access to my tabs and everything seems to function correctly. So hopefully this was useful, and I fully expect Navigation Experimental to change, but at least with the functionality you see here, you can already use it in your application. Thanks for listening.